right, as you're seeing this, I just finished the Iraqi war presentation, so we're doing double duty right now. But this is the war in Afghanistan, or like the war on terror, which I generally think of the war on terror as this kind of like broader military engagement that the U.S. has found, and foreign policy engagement the U.S. has found itself on. So this is just specifically in Afghanistan. This has been going on since September 2001 until now. It's still happening. There's a couple different periods you can divide this into, but for all intents and purposes, the U.S. is still engaged in a military conflict in Afghanistan. So I kind of just, this is generally for when I teach younger kids about this, but terrorism in general is the use of violence to cause terror and general upheaval amongst people. And in our current context, it's usually to bring about a political message. So for most of your life, the U.S. has been focused on terrorist groups associated with Islamic fundamentalism. However, they're not the only terrorist groups in the world. There's a variety of different ones that are centered on various ideologies. But for right now, this is what the U.S. has really been focusing on. There's a couple, like usually we generally try to think about why is the U.S. a target for terrorist attacks, because it has been since at least the Cold War, but you can even go back further than that, depending on what your definition of terrorism looks like. But and just to make it clear, these aren't justifications for terrorist activity. It's just this is why the U.S. is target. So one reason is the U.S. projects a lot of power and influence throughout the world, both economically and politically, and to achieve those goals, often militarily as well. The U.S. military has been heavily involved in the Middle East since the end of the Cold War. So the U.S. has troops in many on 6 different continents, and many countries in the Middle East in particular, especially ones that are generally considered to be sacred in the Islamic faith, especially by the Islamic fundamentalists. U.S. support of Israel in the region in general is a sticking point for a lot of countries in the Middle East specifically, which goes back all the way to the end of World War II. And then the U.S. has supported dictatorships and governments guilty of human rights abuses in order to promote its economic, political, and or security interests. So you can look at the U.S. support of a coup in Iran to overthrow Mossadegh and then install the Shah. You can look at things that happened in Latin America. You can look at getting involved in the 80s in Libya, getting involved in the 80s in Libya, Lebanon, the events of the Suez Crisis. So this is something that usually these non-state actors get upset with this giant country kind of coming around and asserting its political, economic, and security interests on them. So just to clarify a little bit who's who, we're going to talk about the Taliban, which is an Islamic fundamentalist government in Afghanistan. It emerged in the early 1990s. It officially took control of the country of Afghanistan in 1996. It is not the group that did the 9/11 terrorist attacks. That group was Al-Qaeda, and their relationship here is basically while the Taliban was in charge of Afghanistan, they were allowing Al-Qaeda to operate in Afghanistan kind of unchecked, no questions asked really, and then the September 11th attacks happened and the U.S. was upset that this government was allowing a terrorist group to operate in its country. So Al-Qaeda is a militant Islamic organization recently based in Afghanistan, but has a lot of the people that started it came from Saudi Arabia. They support kind of a Wahhabist fundamentalist form of Sunni Islam. It's led by Osama bin Laden until 2011, and the big goal here that you probably saw if you read the bin Laden document is this call for global jihad or a holy war against infidels in the name of Islam. So there he is right there. He was kind of mastermind behind most of these things that we're going to be talking about until his death in 2011. Also, you got the United States and the United Kingdom, and then also a coalition force, including a lot of countries. So this is actually the only time that Article 5 of the NATO Charter has ever been invoked, which is the idea that if one nation is attacked, then the other nations have to support its defense. The only time that's ever actually been invoked was with this. So the U.S. invoked it, and the other NATO countries helped out in defending America with this war on terror. So you have France, Germany, Italy, Jordan, Romania, Georgia, Poland, Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Eventually, that's going to be like right now. There wasn't an Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, but they're going to become one. So we'll get to that in a second here. After September 11th, so after the terrorist attacks, the U.S. government began aerial attacks on Afghanistan after the Taliban refused to hand over bin Laden. So basically, they knew that Osama bin Laden had perpetrated these things, that al-Qaeda eventually was behind it, and they knew that al-Qaeda was operating in Afghanistan, and they asked the Taliban government to find him and hand him over, and they didn't want to do that. I remember like the final negotiation was that they said that they would turn him over to a third-party country like Israel, for example, and then that country could give him over to the U.S. But the U.S. said that wasn't good enough and commenced its military operations against the Taliban in Afghanistan. The other thing, so a little bit of a side note, is that one thing that the Bush administration really tried to do was find evidence immediately. They were trying to find evidence that Saddam Hussein could be linked to the September 11th attacks in some way, or linked to Osama bin Laden, which didn't make a lot of sense because Hussein was a nationalist, and he was very against kind of the sectarian rule, and it would kind of usurp his authority. And they never found any evidence of this, but that was something that they're really pushing, which 2 years later, when there's the invasion of Iraq, there's kind of that connection that way. But the Taliban government had collapsed by December 2001. So again, very, very successful military operations, kicked the Taliban out. Came very close to capturing Osama bin Laden, but he was able to slip through and escape, and went into hiding. Couple other major events. So the U.S. kind of installed a president that they chose, Karzai. He was installed at the end of 2001. Their first presidential elections in which Karzai was reelected were held in 2004. And then since 2006, there's been this increase in levels of insurgency by the Taliban via suicide bombings, sneak attacks, which is what that green versus blue is, just trying to reclaim territory. It's actually intensified more recently in Afghanistan with the Taliban taking over swaths of territory. But the final troop surge was at the end of 2010, where the U.S. put in 30,000 new troops, and that was the final kind of blast towards accomplishing the military objections, and then you see a drawdown from there. On May 2nd, 2001, in Pakistan, there was this operation that commenced called Operation Neptune Spear, and it was Navy SEAL Team 6, and they found out that they believed that Osama bin Laden was hiding in this place right here, this military compound, which was actually like a mile away from like a Pakistani military base, and they found that he was there, and they went in and went to extract him, and ended up killing him, some of his wives, while he was there, and his body was buried in the North Arabian Sea. So let's see if there's anything else I really want to say about this. But the big thing was, like, how did Pakistan not know that Osama bin Laden, he was hanging out like not even very far away from a Pakistani military base? He had been there. How long had he been there for? So raised some questions that way. But he was killed. And again, like, operating separately from this group that becomes ISIS. Osama bin Laden had, by the time ISIS becomes a household name, Osama bin Laden had been dead for about 3 years. But big accomplishment in the scope of the war on terror. So just kind of like the current status of what's happening. So the Allied troops, I just looked it up recently, in Afghanistan is about 17,000. Just for comparison, after the surge that in 2013, a couple years after the final surge, I guess, that number is about 102,000. And then 12,000 of those troops are Americans, compared to 74,000 being in Afghanistan in 2013. I think I compared it to 2013 because that was like the first year that I started like teaching about the war in Afghanistan, and I had those numbers, so I keep it for comparison. Afghan National Security Forces right there, so they've been ramping up the Afghani control over the military operations that are occurring. Up until the most recent numbers I could get were about 2,400 U.S. troops killed, 38,000 civilians, and then the U.S. officially ended major combat operations in 2014. It doesn't mean that they completely left, but for the U.S., spearheading combat operations, that was pretty much done. The rest was either going to be like special forces operations or military advisors training, that kind of thing. New elections were held in April 2017, which was a big deal because it was trying to transfer power from one party to another, and they were worried about how that was going to go. But for the most part, it worked out. Except they did have elections recently, and they're still kind of trying to sort that out because neither side wanted to concede to the other, which is what they were afraid of happening in the 2017 elections. So I'm not quite sure. I think that's still kind of in flux. And then currently you have the Taliban resurgence, where the Taliban is trying to go and retake power. Just this past February, I think it was February 29th, the U.S. and the Taliban signed a peace agreement with one another that the Taliban wasn't going to harbor, terrorists, and that the U.S. was going to, I forget what kind of the nuts and bolts of it was, but they thought they had an agreement, but violence is still occurring between the U.S. and the Taliban even today, so it's not really working out. Here's an example. You got 12,000 troops still remaining, 100,000 civilian casualties, which is deaths, wounded. I think, is missing counting casualties? I think missing's counting in casualties. But mostly, if it's civilians, it's mostly going to be dead and wounded. $18.8 billion is the amount that the U.S. is sending in foreign aid to Afghanistan at this time. So it's considered to be, this situation actually is considered to be getting worse over time, despite the fact that the U.S. was very successful in the beginning. There's a couple other issues that have come about as a result of the war on terror and the war in Afghanistan. So the drug trade is a huge one. Opium has become a major source of profit for Afghanistan. They produce about 90% of the world's opium. If you think about, some of the issues with U.S. opium abuse right now, I haven't done a lot of research on like how much of that is coming from Afghanistan. In terms of like that versus opium being prescribed. But anyway, the Taliban, when it was in power, was kind of keeping that in check, and without them, they've kind of exploded this drug trade that's been occurring. Human rights abuses, so using torture or what they call enhanced interrogation to achieve information, had been going on until it was kind of uncovered, and then the Obama administration stopped doing that. Civilian casualties in general, especially when they're using technology like drones, which we'll get to in a second. Civil liberties, even of Americans. So obviously airport security, like I said in the senior video, you've always had to take your shoes off at the airport since you've been alive, but a lot of heightened security. The Patriot Act was passed and allowed a lot more government surveillance over its own citizens, collecting cell phone data, internet records, library checkouts, doing wiretaps more often, and then drone strikes, which was started to become heavily used in like after 2010. But these unmanned aerial vehicles killing people, there's a lot of debate over whether or not the U.S. should have the authority to be able to just fly over another country and kill suspected terrorists without a trial or anything like that. You don't hear a lot about that anymore. I think a lot because we have a lot of domestic things going on, but that was a huge debate. And then large increases in defense spending. Obviously, the U.S. spends now like $700 billion every year on defense. A lot of that goes to overseas contingencies like this. Also, you've seen this evolution of terrorist activity. So here's the number of terrorist incidents in 2017. The darker it is, the more that have been occurring. But you see the Middle East is a zone where there's quite a bit. Sorry, lost my train of thought there. You got a variety of different groups that are operating. So in Pakistan, for example, you've got both Al-Qaeda and the Taliban still operating. Somalia has had problems with a terrorist group called Al-Shabaab. In Yemen, you have Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Nigeria has a group called Boko Haram, which a few years ago kidnapped a bunch of children. Syria, you've had the Syrian war, has led to a number of groups, including the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which used to be Al-Qaeda in Iraq. While It's a little bit of oversimplification, but basically. And then you've had these more recent like lone wolf attacks where these people just become influenced by these groups, and they don't become part of the group, but they're influenced and they act on behalf of that group in committing these atrocities as well. So it's a continuously evolving situation that U.S. military policy and foreign policy has to deal with, and domestic policy. I mean, you have the Department of Homeland Security. It's the newest cabinet organization that is kind of in charge of protecting the security at home. This is a global conflict tracker across the U.S. The Council of Foreign Relations does this. If you're interested in foreign relations, international relations, foreign policy, it's a really good website. It came about, actually, it started with John Foster Dulles, who I actually don't like, but I do like the CFR. Anyway, you got these situations that have been going on over time. Obviously, you can see we talked about Mexico back during the Mexican Revolution. You got these issues going on. But again, very clustered in the Middle East and in Northern Africa. So I think that's most of what I got for you. I used to talk a lot about different enhanced interrogation methods. It's not as much of an issue anymore now that they've kind of stopped doing it for the most part. So I'm gonna just leave it there. You can check that out if you want. One thing they used to do is they used to play Justin Bieber in Guantanamo Bay, just like all day. That was their torture method. I thought that was strange. But anyway, that's kind of an overview. Obviously, it's a continuously evolving situation, but of kind of where we came from and where we stand on the war on terror.